Welcome to the second episode of the Inclusion Exchange, creating a culture of accountability. In today's episode, our host, Natalie Denny, will be putting questions to Mandeep Rupra, Head of Equity, Diversity and Inclusion at national charity Citizens Advice, as she talks about how she's developed change through engaging with senior leadership and developing an accountability framework and a number of initiatives to support the embedding of EDI across the whole organisation.
Hi everyone, welcome to the Inclusion Exchange. I'm really happy to be here today to have another fantastic conversation about equity, diversity and inclusion. I'm going to introduce you to our fabulous guest today, Mandeep Rupra. Mandeep has headed up the EDI team at Citizens Advice since January 2020. She is an accomplished equity, diversity and inclusion change agent and qualified change management practitioner with over 20 years experience in consultants, leadership and management roles across the public and third sector. Mandeep is passionate about and has a proven record of spearheading change to improve organisational practice on advancing EDI and challenging the status quo. Core to her practice is her belief in the importance of centering lived experience and undertaking the work with honesty, courage, transparency and humility, all amazing things to have at the centre. Mandeep works across all EDI areas and specialises in racial equity, taking a social justice approach to all of her work. In her current role, she is responsible for the strategic direction of Citizens Advice EDI agenda. So I would like to welcome Mandeep to the Inclusion Exchange today.
Thanks so much, Natalie and Io. It's great to be here.
It's so lovely to have you here. We feel absolutely honoured to have you today to come and tell us all about your amazing work and the amazing sort of ethos and methodology, which I really find fascinating and really important in this type of work. So what I would like to start off with is, first of all, saying you tweet at Rupra, if anyone wants to follow, and also your origin story. It's so interesting to learn about people who are involved in equity, diversity, and inclusion work. So how did you get into this area and what do you do?
Yeah, I mean, I love this question. I don't think there's a straightforward answer to it. I mean, my CV, if you looked at my origin story and what my CV would show, it's that I started as a teacher in the late 90s on an estate in South London where there was high levels of social deprivation and high levels of ethnic diversity as well. And that led me to want to focus on working with young people really holistically and specifically in relation to their diverse identities and how that impacts how they navigate the world. So I left that to manage a young people's program about challenging oppression and conflict resolution. And that's when I began to really focus on EDI and specifically on race equity and the impact of oppression on well-being and mental health on an individual and a collective level. And then I did my MA in race and ethnic studies. And that's when I really spent a few years just focusing on race equity. And it was at the time of the recommendations had come out from the Macpherson report. So I worked at a race equality council where local authorities were working to really implement those recommendations to address race hate incidents. I'm not going to go through every role that I've had, but I've worked within the higher education sector. I've had my own consultancy. I've done some work in the US as well around this work. I've worked predominantly in the charity sector with what I do. Now, that's what my CV would say, but I would say my origin story shows that I feel I was guided into this work. You know, as a second generation South Asian girl, I grew up acutely aware of my difference. I grew up acutely aware of having less value in society from the moment I left the door, and that anyone that looked like me or my parents didn't belong here because of the things that were said to me growing up. So for me, that impacted every aspect of how I navigated the world, school, social life. Watching my mum, who I grew up, who had clinical depression, and she didn't have culturally competent care, and all lots of stereotypes around Asian women, which there continue to be. So, I feel really deeply about the experiences of people and communities experiencing oppression. And I know what that's like because I am one of those people. and marginalized girls can become marginalized women. So that marginalization for me never stopped. It's been at every aspect of continues to be. And I just want to say, for me, like, a really integral part of my healing has been sharing and holding space to discuss lived experience, systemic oppression with people of color, particularly women of color. And that community has helped me to really find my voice. So in terms of how I got here, I would say I'm a real product of hope, resistance, collectivism, and tenacity. That's how I've got here. And I do this work because I know oppression and systemic injustice is real. I know the impact of it, and I want to be part of creating that change. And I know the power of shared experience. And I want to really use the voice that I didn't have when I was a lot younger, and I know what a difference that can make.
Amazing. Thank you so much. What an answer, Mandeep. I love the sort of splicing of the personal, the professional, the political. I think that really has an impact on, sort of worldview, experiences, activism, and about how you make that change in the world. So it was really, interesting to learn about sort of how you seeing yourself from the professional CV perspective, but also through that lived experience, and how, we can't value one over the other. We have to sort of measure as rounded, truly authentic individuals. So thank you so much for sharing that. So in terms of your origins, what were the sort of most positive parts about that, and what were the hardest parts about that? And I ask this question because I think sometimes for people who are in, the EDI world, we can be really focused on, solutions, and be really focused on what's wrong. But there's also sort of a lot of joy and a lot of, just sheer fabulousness from being from a certain area or being a marginalized person. And so I would like to know what the hardest part about your story, but also what were the most positive parts about them as well.
Yeah, so I am going to start with the most positive, because people will always know when I've been in meetings, whether it's about Black History Month or anything else, and I'll go, I don't want to just not, oppression is not all that we are. Being a woman of color is amazing. I love it. It's the best. I wouldn't change it. There's so much fabulousness around that. And knowing what our history is, and the richness and the collectivism and the view world that, and there's such pride within that. And I love the solidarity that I have with other women of color around it. So, and like I said, there's such healing in that. So there's been so many positives for me. People always say to me, why? You're always smiling and you do this work. You're always really hopeful. And I'm like, well, you've got to be hopeful when you do what we do, right, Natalie? So, but I know the change this work creates, and that's what drives me. I see it when people tell me, whether it's an ally saying what a difference it's made, whether it's someone who's marginalized and saying what a difference the work has made to them. So there are so many positives when people share those stories, or I see the journey that I support an organization to go on. And it's, not sound cliche, but we're trying to change the world a little at a time. In terms of what's difficult, I mean, we could spend the whole webinar on what's difficult as an EDI practitioner and when you're a woman of colour doing this work. But I think growing up as part of the origin story, just not seeing anyone that looked like me do this work, a lack of representation, trying to find where I fit, and then experiencing oppression within that. And in terms of how I got here, I think what's really difficult is just because I might be, have done this for as long as I've done it, doesn't mean I still don't experience the same things that I'm fighting against. And that's really hard, can be really difficult, can be exhausting. I'm very big on vulnerable leadership. So, it's hard to be, whether you're in all white spaces and you're trying to talk about race equity. And I'm always really mindful of what that is like for me, positions where I am as a woman of colour saying it. And how am I safe in those spaces when I'm having those conversations? What might happen. So I've had to learn along the way through the various moments of burnout and not feeling safe, what will keep me safe in doing this. So, I mean, there's more I could say, but I'll stop.
No, thank you so much. And I think, your line about vulnerable leadership is so important, because it is lots of stereotypes around women of colour in terms of being, resilient and strong and, carrying the weight of the world on the shoulders, and sometimes doesn't allow space for vulnerability and for us being honest and open about the impact that this type of work has. that it is important work, that it is work that needs to be done, that, many of us, embrace with open arms, but it's also about it being a battle a lot of the time. And it's about,
sure.
The hazards of war, so to speak, if we go down that analogy. Thank you so much for that. And so the second question that I've got is, why should people be accountable or responsible for equality, equity, diversity and inclusion? And what does accountability for EDI mean to you?
Yeah, great question. Because it's something I feel so strongly about, because, often, there'll be like an EDI lead or a practitioner in the organization, and they can be viewed as the only ones being accountable or responsible for advancing EDI. And for me, that's hugely problematic. I've been in those roles, or it's me trying to change everything. And that really sets up the work in the wrong way for me. It's either it will mean it won't have the impact that it needs to have, and it could even mean that it fails. Particularly as in a lot of spaces I've seen, EDI teams are quite often under-resourced. And, I think I'm going to go back to what you said at the beginning, that I take a social justice approach to my work. And that's how we deliver it at Citizens Advice. And that, that's part of our EDI agenda. So for me, if we understand in this work, we've got a forefront equity, and equality is important. That's the end state we want to get to. But we have to consider the systemic barriers that marginalised groups face and how we deliver our service. And to really, really understand, to do that effectively, we need to understand how systemic injustice works. And based on our identities, we are all socialised to have a level of privilege and power, depending on what our identities are. I'm a straight cis woman. I have a range of privileges as a result of that, due to being in a heteronormative world. That's going to impact how I see the world. It impacts my actions. If I'm not aware, I will use that privilege to recreate that heteronormative world, or once I'm aware of that privilege, I can interrupt it and challenge it. And which is why, for me, we all are accountable for advancing EDI, because everyone who comes into the workplace has a level of power or privilege, or is minoritized in some way. So we all have a role to play, because just as there's oppression and systemic injustice externally, that is replicated in organizations. Racism exists, sexism, transphobia, ableism, you name it, it will be there. And people will say it's institutionalized, it's systemic. Absolutely. But it's people that create those things. So we got to start with everyone.
Yeah.
Sorry, did you want to say something?
No, I was just sort of linking into your point about, we're all holding various levels of privilege, and about us interrogating that and understanding intersectionality and that. I often use myself as an example for this. So I've been deaf since birth, but not to the extent where it had a massive impact on my life until about 3 years ago. And obviously what happened about 3 years ago was a pandemic where everyone was wearing masks. I couldn't lip read anymore, and I didn't realise the extent to which I relied on lip reading to be able to communicate. So, phoning the doctors, going to Sainsbury's, doing things like that became a massive big deal. And it was interesting because I started thinking about, well, if I ever really thought about this in any detail before to this extent, and it was because I was in there and I was experiencing it firsthand, and the barriers were stark, and they weren't barriers that I could just sort of navigate quite easily. I had to sort of have aids to help me sort of just interact in everyday life. And I wanted to link this point to this idea of accountability, and about how sometimes if we're not in it, we would feel like it's not our problem, or it's nothing to do with us, or it's, we've got so much other things to do. And I think you were going there in terms of accountability and how we all had privilege. What sort of things do you think can stop people feeling accountable for this type of work?
I think it's exactly what you've just said. It's people's positionality in that, well, I'm not a woman, I can't do anything about that. Oh, I don't have a disability. I'm not disabled, so I can't, that, like, it doesn't impact me. And I think that's really about the way that we, not to get too academic here, but like the structure in the way society is. Like, if you're going to experience more privilege, if you're not thinking about those things, that's privilege in action. You're not having to think about marginalization. And I think when people have to start thinking about that, it's very uncomfortable. You don't want to think about those things and look like, what is my role in that? And people can get just shut down with the guilt. And I can talk more to that. I think there's that. I think a barrier to accountability is actually knowing what it means. What does it mean? And actually knowing that everyone does have a role to play in it. And also practical application of this work. You know, I'm here for every book, I'm here for the academic element of EDI, but I'm here to create change through practical application. And we can talk about the understanding and EDI literacy is super important, but people need to know how to translate that into everyday work and the way that they undertake their work and the relationships that they have. So I think there are lots of barriers to accountability, and it's hard. This work is hard, essentially. It's not easy.
That's it. It's not easy. And I think sometimes when working with organisations, there's lots of wants of a quick fix of something, you know, that can allow them to say, we've done this or we've been on this training. And it's like, well, you know, this type of inequality, this oppression, you know, will took hundreds of years to sort of embed into our structures and the way we live our lives. So it will take a longer time to unpick and undo and unlearn, you know, from a generational perspective. And that leads really into the next question about factors that you think influence people to become more accountable. We've talked a little bit about it can be difficult and that how it can be a barrier, but what are the sorts of things that you have seen from your own experience and practice that influence people to be more accountable?
So there's lots of things. When I joined Citizens Advice, which is just over 2.5 years ago, and to really start to think about how to create that culture of accountability, I think there's a couple of things that I'll share. And if you've got time, I'm happy to share more. The first thing I did was to ensure everyone understood why they need to have a collective responsibility. I made it very clear, I always do. It is not mine or the EDI team's job to address all the equality disparities in the organisation. It is our job to provide the framework and the subject matter expertise to support everyone else, and that we all have a collective responsibility. So, the way that I talked about EDI was that it's, you know, for me, it's part of the nucleus of Citizens Advice. We are integral to everything. When you think of the clients that come to us, it's equality disparities that are bringing our clients to us for advice, particularly now with the cost of living crisis. If you look at disability benefits, PIP, housing discrimination issues, it is so, you know, we are in the centre of the organisation, and that means it's everyone's responsibility to make sure we look at that. So for me, it was really clear about clearly articulating how our EDI approach supports our organisational priorities. So if people, you know, not everyone's in the same space of this, so they're not going to be as passionate as maybe you and I are, Natalie. So it's about knowing more like the business case and why is it so relevant. Another thing that we did, and you talked about a training program, but I worked really hard in the first year and a half on building EDI capability and literacy. You know, we say EDI and people say words like inclusion, but what do those really mean? Do we say oppression? Do we talk about power and privilege? Do we talk about allyship? Of course, we take a social justice model, so we do, but we developed a year-long learning program, and it was very detailed, and there was learning. It was very supportive, and it was online modules. It was reflective sessions, peer-to-peer groups. So it was really about not just going into a one-day training, but it was really tangible, and the shifts were amazing as a result of that, what happened. So that's another thing that I did. I take role modelling very seriously, and I do a lot of work with our leaders around accountability. So people always say to me that I create a supportive but challenging environment where no one is allowed to look the other way when it comes to this work. And yeah, I would agree with that feedback. So, you know, I meet regularly with, whether it's our executive, our directors, our leadership group as a whole. There are sessions around what I always talk about visible EDI leadership, not inclusive leadership, visible leadership. Because if people aren't seeing it, if people can't feel that day to day, and it's not visible, it doesn't mean anything. And it's not about just reading books about what inclusive leadership means. So there's a lot of work I have done in terms of building confidence and capability of leaders. And for me, that's really important, because every organisation, I don't think there's one where I've been in where staff have not had a lack of trust in the leadership's ability to lead on EDI. And that's something that I constantly, like, there's all the time, it's on my agenda to build up the leadership within that space. But being really supportive as well around that accountability, I think, is really important. I know not everyone knows the answers. That's why there's an EDI team. But I will coach and I will challenge and I will help you with the answers. But then something has to happen around that. And one of the things that I'm in the process of creating is an accountability framework for our executive team, so that EDI can be considered, prioritised, embedded and delivered in all aspects of what we do in our directorates in citizens advice. Has to start from the top. So there's lots of things. I mean, I've used data to inform business planning and how we prioritise and looking at our quality disparities. So it's really integrated in the way that we do our work. And I can see that, and you'll go to meetings, not EDI specific meetings, but people are talking about it because they know. They'll talk about minoritized clients. They'll talk of the cost of living crisis on those that are disabled and what that means, because now the narrative around EDI is that it's not just that team's work, it's the organisation's work.
And that sounds like amazing, where it's like really a social justice approach, holistic, not isolating areas, but actually embedding it into the framework, the bread and butter of an organisation, to make real tangible change that lasts. And I think from what I'm hearing from you, a lot of this takes time that organisations have to, commit to, and resources and energy on the long term.
That's so true. And I think that's a key downfall it can be, where people want change quickly. And it's like, change doesn't come quick with this work. Building, if there's a deficit of trust around EDI, you can't shift that. I can say that Citizens Advice have absolutely illustrated a commitment to this, in that the size of my team has tripled, in the resource, and I'm not saying that's enough. There's always more, but that just shows there's not two people doing just this work. And so it absolutely takes time, which is why the piece around honesty and transparency for me is key. If we're not making progress, let's say we're not making progress, and we know we're not making progress because this is going to be really difficult and it's going to take a long time. I can't give you an update on progress in the next quarter because it won't be made in the next quarter because of the work that we're trying to do here. So, and I think it's also really important to see the wins. I'm not sitting here saying I can alleviate systemic injustice in a workplace. No one person can do all of that, but the shifts that we can make in a short space of time, I think, should also be really celebrated and acknowledged.
I think that's so important, and that links to one of your first points about when we were talking about joy and about the positives and about hope. Yeah. And your approach is one of hope, because it galvanizes people. It sort of re-energizes people to commit to this work, which is so important and so needed. So that sort of leads me on to, we're talking about, these initiatives that you've carried out, whether it be in Citizens Advice or elsewhere. Have you got any particular approach or initiative that you are, especially proud of, that you feel like, even if it was when you first done it, it was a catalyst and it was, you seen the seeds, planted the seed and you see them grow later? Is there anything that sort of for you feel that was a piece of work that really transformed, people and practices that you would like to share with us?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with just build on what I said around the EDI learning to build capability around our social justice approach. I mean, the impact that has had is quite phenomenal in the way that staff talk about allyship, staff that you would never talking about equity, and now our biggest allies and proponents of advancing equity. And the way that people even said they want to raise their children differently as a result of the training. It was just amazing to see that change. And I think the key around it was, again, creating a supportive and assertive structure around that to enable people to learn. So that is one. Another one is when I worked in an organisation that just wasn't talking about race equity. And organizations, I would say that particularly with that and trans inclusion, organizations still will find those areas difficult to discuss. And I remember thinking, I wasn't in a leadership position at that point. And I spoke to my manager and I said, I was an EDI practitioner, but I said, I want to write to the CEO and let them know what I'm seeing. And that's what I did. And they invited me for a conversation and I gave some ideas. They were very surprised because it wasn't a part of how they had navigated the workspace. They were a white man, and it was a catalyst for so much work within that organization. And, I heard staff saying that they stayed in the organization as a result of that work. I still hear from staff saying that it really raised their consciousness around, how they can thrive in a workplace as a person of color and what they should have. So I'm really proud of that, because I think, like I said, when you're someone of color, oppression, or anyone who's marginalized, oppression is not all that we are. I think joy is an act of resistance. We're not set up to experience joy easily. And I think when you give people spaces for that joy and being able to thrive in the workplace is so powerful.
I would completely agree with you there, Mandeep. One of the organisations that I'm involved in and co-founded is the Goddess Projects based in Liverpool. So we work with support Black women and women of colour to develop and achieve in their communities. So we have like a weekly walking session around the park. We have a book club where we look at specifically Black women writers. We have a festival every year that looks at sort of issues or areas that Black women are interested in. We have like a big support group of like 80 Black women from, around the areas that support each other. And one of the reasons why we actually first started this was because we wanted that safe space and, to not have to explain ourselves. But the other side was that when we were together, we didn't stop laughing. We had such a lovely time. We were cackling like a gaggle of witches, which I quite enjoy. So it was just that we felt so much, sort of sisterhood, so much, support of each other. And we wanted to replicate that through a smaller friendship group to a wider group of the women that we have and non-binary people within our communities that we wanted to support. So that was about 4 years ago, and it just creates a really lovely space to celebrate each other and celebrate the wins. And I hold that quite central to the work that I do around EDI. I try and be creative with that work, but I also try and ensure that people are aware that we do this work because it's important, but we do this work because, we as holistic individuals are worthy of that respect, support, and just joy, all out joy. So it's lovely to hear that as something really central to what you do with your work, because I do think it really makes a difference, especially when you are delivering to people who might be quite resistant about it. If they think, as you said, you're going to make them read a boring academic text, or you're going to take them down a theory that is quite obscure and dense. Whereas if you are doing reflective things like you've done within your work, and you have it more as sort of a learning environment, which is a really supportive environment, I just find that works a lot better than getting people invested in the change.
Yeah, I mean, resistance is a really big thing to deal with when you're trying to create organizational change. I'm not going to sit here for a minute and I go into organizations and everyone's like, yeah, whatever you want us to do, Mandeep, we'll do it. You're absolutely right. That does not always happen. And I understand that, because I understand how everything is set up and the structures of society are replicated in an organization. So I have to do a lot of work on how I challenge that resistance, but challenge it in a way that I believe a lot in call-in culture rather than call-out culture.
Yeah.
And that to bring everyone. And if people aren't on board with a particular, and this is intrinsic to the organization, it's important for people to think, well, these are our values. So those are the expectations of how you work here.
Yeah. I love that call-in, not call-out. I love that. That's a really good way of describing a really complex subject. Yeah, and it's a hard thing to do, but it's a really, really positive way of simplifying something which is integral to this type of work.
Yeah, I mean, that does, and when I talk about calling culture, that doesn't mean for a moment, because everyone who knows me will know that I will say if there's something that's not okay, but I do it in a way that keeps safety for the person to understand, and allows them to grow from it, rather than being in a space where sometimes call out culture can be, you've done this, that equates to X, I'm not going to work with you now.
Yeah.
And that doesn't help what we're really trying to create and the broader piece. I'm not saying I don't understand why people, because feelings can, this is our lives when people are minoritized, and it's really all for allies. It's very serious work. But I take calling culture really seriously. And I think that's how you create collective responsibility as well. Leaders often will say to me, I enable a space where they know they don't know anything, but they're willing to explore because I have got the call in. I'll be supportive and I'll challenge where I need to challenge. So, yeah, I think it's really important.
Well, I'm having a lovely time, Mandeep. I could sit here and talk to you all day.
I could too, Natalie.
I'm going to go to one of our questions from our audience. This one's from Michael. And it's quite topical at the moment because it's linking into the cost of living and austerity measures. So Michael says, do you think EDI in the public sector will be able to thrive in the next few years? Will we enter a new phase of austerity cuts to public services? And if so, is there a strong enough publicly available business case to help defend EDI budgets?
Such a good question. I think if we don't... Okay, I've got two answers to that. Do I think EDI budgets can survive during? Yes, because we have to make them survive. Because if we haven't seen through the pandemic and the cost of living crisis in terms of the disparity of equality disparities between those that have, depending on identity and where they come from, socioeconomic background, EDI is central to all of that. If we are thinking about a socially just world, that is one where everyone has access to employment, education, equity of resources, respect and dignity. We are not in that space. And austerity makes that worse. We know that, for example, and I just want to give a content warning, which I probably should have given at the beginning around talking, but domestic violence has increased during the pandemic and during the cost of living crisis. So EDI for me is you cannot deal with those areas without taking the social justice approach and knowing why it's integral. It will make your services better. You will be able to service your communities better if you safeguard that. You will be able to employ, recruit and retain, because I always say it's one thing to get people through the door, but it's keeping people in the organisation and enabling them to progress and thrive if you take an EDI approach. I was reading research that was some global research that was done and in a couple of places, and another piece of research that Harvard Business Review was talking about, and I think it was Deloitte that did it, and it was like 10,000 millennials were involved in it, and EDI was viewed as an integral element of why people choose to either leave an organisation because they think the organisation isn't doing EDI well, or to go to an organisation. So, I mean, I think, in the public sector, it should be safeguarded because it will make the work more credible. But I also know how it goes. And often EDI is seen as one of the first things to go when, you're looking at money. So, yeah, it's a difficult one.
And I think, one of the things that I deliver when I do any of my EDI work is talk about sort of productivity levels from, in a language that a lot of corporates can understand in terms of, their profits and things like that, which is trying to home in on the fact that it becomes a chicken and egg situation, because if you don't do this type of work, then the other type of work is not going to happen. There's so much research that shows that organisations that have EDI as a positive, integral force in their organisation, are more innovative, are more, happier workers,
all of that.
Better environments for everyone, not just for, the people who are seen as marginalised within an organisation. And it is about, shouting loud and being really open and honest and making some of this stuff really available for people to use as evidence when they're putting together the business case. Because unfortunately, in many organisations, money seems to be the main area, especially in an environment like what is happening to our country at the moment.
Absolutely. And I think that piece I was saying about that research is key in terms of your talent pipeline. People are a lot more aware of the need for equity and inclusion and belonging in an organization and what that means, and they have expectations of what they want to see now. So it impacts your talent acquisition, who you are able to recruit and retain, or you will lose people. They will just, as we know with the Great Resignation, people will leave, and they have options of where they want to go. So
I think I was reading about this sort of, tagline of quiet quitting about individuals that are not going above and beyond anymore and are working their hours and then bouncing, which, is something which seems to be coming into a new consciousness of millennials and younger in the generation as well. But, all of these things, what I find is that if people are happy in the environment that they are, and they're in a positive way environment, then they are more likely to do the additional things that, provide more input to an organization. So as you said, I think people are thinking more with the feet, and they're doing it in a way that, maybe generations gone by didn't think they had the opportunity to do.
I think it's exactly that. EDI, is now, I would say, should never be seen as a tick box or a side project that if you can add it in, you should do it. It should be integral. So, if an organization sees it like that, then in terms of cutting budgets, I would really hope that leaders really understand it in that way and not cut EDI budgets teams, because teams are normally quite small anyway, and we're under a lot of pressure.
Or one. I was having conversations about this, and we'll get to this at some point today, talking about sort of looking after ourselves and our well-being. But I've been having many conversations with many people from different, institutions where there's just one person who's supposed to, cater to thousands of staff, and and it's just not acceptable. I'm just going to move on to the next question. They've started coming in now, so that's really fabulous. From Melanie, talking about senior leaders in an organisation who are supportive of things and how that can make it easier. So the question is, how do you initially get leaders and those who are in a position to make change happen on board and convince them equality work is crucial and that ultimately they are responsible, especially as some external factors are sending messages that the word work is woke, woke and unnecessary?
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. And I think, woke, I'm not going to go into a historical discussion around it. But actually, if you look at the origins of what that was, it was a very positive thing. The issue is it's become weaponized now and seen as a problematic area. I have no issue if people want to call me or their team woke. If you look at the original meaning of that, yes, we are. But I kind of don't buy into that, because it's all a way to distract from the work that we're doing. I think there are definitely things, though, that you have to consider. Because we know about culture wars, and do organisations really want to shout loud about these areas? And what would that mean in terms of, is there a reputational risk? Is there a brand risk around that? And I think it's about taking a really holistic approach. You have to start with senior leaders with the why. It's never, I always say, this isn't because Mandeep says this is important. It's not my thing. It's important because this will be the impact if we do it. This is how it supports the organisation. This is your role within it. So I have a lot of conversations with leaders. I meet all the time with our chief exec and our executive board around what their role is within it. Now, and if there are challenges and resistance with any leaders, that then shows me, okay, I need to find out where people are at to know which technique I use to influence within that space. Now, if it's worry around reputational risk, it's making sure we do it in the right way. That doesn't mean we're just risk averse and we don't shout loud about things we want to talk about, but we do it in a credible way, and we're not tokenistic or performative in how we do this work. So I think it's about being there for the long haul, because not all leaders, because it can feel scary as well if you get it wrong. Though with call out culture, this is what's going to happen if I say the wrong thing. So it's really important for me with senior leaders to give them then the tools and be really practical about what does that mean. If you don't know, how do you deal with it if you don't know? And I always say, if you're not feeling uncomfortable, you are not doing this work to leaders. So that's just part of this work. But then I guide them on how you move through that. So it's about having very honest conversations with senior leaders, coaching with senior leaders, looking at the benefit to the organization. I'm very, now when I go into leadership spaces, I mean, the leadership space in Citizens Advice is one I am extremely proud of, in how there is that collective responsibility with EDI now. And when I think about other leadership spaces that I get invited to, there is a lot more of I will say, an intellectual understanding of the importance of EDI now. But what there isn't is, for some, there's still a resistance of coming out of their comfort zone and what they have to change to do. It's like the rest of the organization, but we as leaders can stay the same. It's for everyone else in the rest of the organization.
Thank you so much. So the next question sort of leads on to that. We've talked about the positive ways of engaging with leadership, engaging with organizations in terms of honesty, in terms of, making the case for why this will, improve an organization. What approaches would you not recommend in EDI work? And have you seen any that, really backfired?
I think the first thing is, there's lots of things. One of the things I say is be specific and prioritize on the areas that you want to focus on. If you're trying to do everything, you're going to use your data rather than saying we're going to look at everything from in the equality space, because there is so much. For me, I feel very strongly that you should not take a deficit fixing approach to this work. You see it when you look at, there was a lot around women in senior leadership roles and this kind of notion of women just need to lean in a little bit more, and this leaning culture. And I remember going, I don't need to lean in. I just need to be let into the room. And because it's the systemic barriers that aren't allowing. And deficit fixing approaches where I see organizations that might do leadership programs for women or people of color or disabled staff, but all the systems and structures around that in terms of how managers support their direct reports, all of that isn't looked at. And that's a deficit fixing approach, because it locates the problem with those marginalized staff. And that's not where the problem is. It's systemically where the problem is. So I think that is something. I think it's important to go beyond theory and make it really tangible. And what does it look like on an individual, cultural and institutional level, so people understand what that means. And of course, like I said, we talk about power and privilege, but then I always then talk about, okay, then you get to use your power and privilege as allyship. You get to do that to create change, and that's what could that look like in how you create your projects, how you do your work. I think another way that is problematic in terms of creating change is an over-reliance on staff networks. I think staff networks are amazing, powerful spaces, and they're really important and should be safeguarded, but they are not your EDI practitioners. And there's a lot of burden and responsibility put on staff networks, and there's a lot of emotional labour within those spaces, and that can lead to burnout. I would say tokenism is another, people will do this and think there are going to be lots of quick wins, and we're going to tweet and we're going to say this and we're going to say how great it is to work here during Black History Month. And it's like, no, it's a lot more than just doing that. It's the long-term, day-to-day commitment. It's not about your social media presence, as I've said. You have to have a real understanding. If you understand how systemic injustice works, then you can't take a tokenistic approach. So for me, you have to really centre the voices of marginalised people in the work that you do, so people feel heard and you create trust. Because often when organisations are trying to do EDI work, those staff haven't felt heard. And if you undertake tokenistic kind of approaches, that will just make that trust even worse. I think, that piece around accountability as well it's got to be a collective effort. And I think another piece I just want to say is, as a woman of colour leading this work, you also have to protect yourself. I often see fellow colleagues, and they're always from a marginalised background, predominantly they are women of colour, in burnout as a result of doing this work. So it's important that organisations are really cognizant of the emotional labour and the impact of those leading this work as well, and what needs to happen, and where are the allies, when you're constantly going into spaces where you might be the only person as well. I've talked about don't think you're going to feel comfortable as well. So I think there's lots of things that don't work and what you need to do. But yeah, I'll leave it.
Oh no, I'm just fascinated. I think, your point you made about the burden being put on, people to run the EDI teams and run the EDI initiatives with, no extra pay sometimes, and it's their problem. It sort of detracts, and it sort of does what, the status quo wants us to do. It doesn't allow us to make tangible change because it puts the burden on people who may already be burnt and under oppression that they're facing on a day-to-day. I think, talking about, the burnout and EDI fatigue, about how that can really impact on people's experiences, whether from a consultant perspective or whether from someone who is taking it all on board. And it's about protection because we do want to make life better for everyone, but specifically we're trying to support people of colour who are within these organisations. And sometimes I've seen where things are being pointed towards our Black colleagues or, pointed towards our Asian colleagues. And it's like, well, do you think that these people are oppressing themselves? There might be some hand in it on some level, but there needs to be a wider understanding. I think a lot of it comes from, you mentioned about intellectual conversations before, and on a definitional level, just for a very base level, a lot of people don't really have that nuanced understanding of what these words mean. And a lot of the stuff that I do, we always start off with understanding. So we're on the same page when I'm talking about institutional racism or I'm talking about equity, you understand that. You don't think that it's at an individual level we're talking about of slurs on a day-to-day in the street. You understand where we're coming from. So I think it's really important. I'm going to jump to one of our questions from Jenny. And this talks about you talked about the importance of sharing lived experience with organisations. Do you have some advice for those of us in organisations where senior leaders say they want to hear about our experience, but the number of people of colour is so low that it's impossible to anonymise anyone's disclosure, and those disclosures are likely to affect career progression?
That's a really good question. I think there's a way of doing it that there'll be two ways, because I'm sure the fact that there's so few people of colour anyway, there's some data there that there's a problem that you've only got. So I think it's about the qualitative data, the lived experience, backed up with maybe like what your recruitment and retention numbers are showing. But if there are only a few, what I would say is I normally then theme it. I don't make it specific. These are the kind of areas. But if there are two people, for example, I'm being hypothetical, and it is going to really make people feel unsafe, I wouldn't do it. What I would do is look at research from other, the issues are the same regardless of sector. Every time I undertake research, I read research, it's exactly the same. It has been for the last 2 decades. Use that to say, this is what people are experiencing in workplaces. Ours won't be any different. And you can back it up with, you can have that conversation if staff are willing to have those conversations with you and you know what the themes are. But think about then, how do you share that with senior leaders? And I would just say, use other research to back it up, because every organisation will, many organisations have an issue where there's a lack of progression for people of colour. There's not enough senior leaders of colour. And the issues are very similar, and there are intersectional issues. So women of colour have a particular, the Fawcett and Runnymede report that came out, broken ladders, use that to back it up, because also what can be said then, there's only a few staff though. So we don't really, you don't want the number to undermine what you're trying to change. Because if it's like, well, we've only got 5 people, so there's not really an issue, we can't really say there's a theme of experience. But I think it's a great question, because the safety of people wanting to share is really important.
Yeah, it really is. And I think that leads on to my last question. It's for Lou. In terms of well-being of yourself, Mandeep, and well-being of your staff, what are the sorts of things and circles that you've created within the workplace or outside that allow you to be able to come to work every day and do this type of work and create people?
Such a good question. With my team, I'm great in that we practice a lot around talking about the positives, gratitudes, looking at workload. We talk about allyship. We give a lot of collective care to one another. We talk about the emotional labour and we give each other space to talk about the impact and create boundaries around the work that we do and each other. For myself, I think I oscillate in terms of how well I do that. I've definitely experienced burnout in the role that I do. I feel there's so much to do, and I'm always, you're pushing to try and do as much. And it's sometimes you have to really check your own perspective to acknowledge what you have done rather than what you haven't done. So I am very cognizant of burnout for myself, because when in my role, there's a lot that I'm giving all the time. I'm in a lot of different spaces and context switching. So I have learned what works for me and what that means in terms of my own self-care, and that will be different. So what I need to switch off, and now I try my best to be a lot more boundaried around that and what I need to do and what will make me laugh, what will take my mind off, what do I want to watch, who do I want to be with, I meditate. I take a very holistic approach in terms of my well-being.
Amazing. And just finally, is there anything that you would like to finish on, Mandeep, in terms of the topics that we've been discussing today?
No, just to say that I absolutely acknowledge that this work isn't easy, and it's okay to start small, but we all have that potential to be a change agent. We are all change agents because we all have a role to play. Like I said, we're all set up to have a certain role in creating the structures. So yeah, that's it really. And I just hope it's been informative for those. I've really enjoyed it. It's been great to speak to you.
Oh, I've loved it. Thank you so much, Mandeep. And I'm really excited for, to follow your work in the future. And hopefully we'll be able to come back and have some conversations again at some point in the future as well. So thank you so much. It's been so fascinating. It's been really engaging. And I just hope everyone has enjoyed it today. The podcast will be available online. And so you can go back and listen to it afterwards as well for people who might not be able to make it today. But yeah, all my thanks and sort of admiration towards you, Mandeep, and the amazing work that you're doing at the Citizens Advice and Beyond. Thank you for everything that you do. And thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Natalie.